It's not very often that a new genre arises in the video game industry. Usually it's the result of an advance in technology making new things possible, like when three-dimensional environments made atmospheric survival horror possible. Sometimes it's a result of the creation of something in pop culture that finds its way into the gaming industry. This was the case with extreme sports games. While standard American sports have tracked all the way back to the beginning of the video game industry, back in the 1970s, extreme sports were not a cultural entity until the late 1980s and early 1990s, and thus weren't a subgenre of video game sports until around that same time. With early skateboarding games like Skate or Die, and later attempts in 3D like Sony's Extreme Sports series, the extreme sports genre was more of a basic description of what these games entailed than it was an actual classification for a genre. That was until a PlayStation game rolled onto store shelves in September of 1999, and that game was called Tony Hawk Pro Skater. Put together by a relatively unknown little development studio called Neversoft, and sponsored by the major publisher Activision, the game went on to be one of the last big hits for the PlayStation, and one of the titles to help video games in general break even further into the mainstream with casual consumers. The game became famous for its accurate and well-tuned skating and trick mechanics, blended perfectly with its embrace of another alternative subculture of pop-punk and ska music licensed for the soundtrack. These two things helped the game merge a number of zeitgeists, with skating culture, alternative music, and the burgeoning video game industry all coming together to produce a cultural touchstone at the very end of the 1990s. Naturally, such a successful title got a plethora of ports to other systems, with the Nintendo 64 getting a comparable but scaled-down version that was made to fit onto a cartridge, and the Dreamcast getting an enhanced port with much cleaner textures, a higher resolution, and smoother frame rates. Neversoft and Activision would repeat this performance with a sequel the following year that would improve even further on the original, with bigger, more complex environments, and even a level editor to let players make their own arenas. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 would get the same kind of ports as well, with a downgraded N64 version and an upgraded Dreamcast version. Although the game released right on the eve of the PlayStation 2's launch, it actually skipped the PlayStation 2 altogether, leaving the Dreamcast alone with the only next-gen version of the series so far. However, this would all quickly change in 2001. For while Neversoft and Activision pointedly skipped out on the PlayStation 2's launch, they were indeed feverishly working on building a whole new game from the ground up just for the PS2. And that would of course become Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3. Just another year after the last game released, Neversoft would pull off an incredibly rare hat trick by lining up a third iteration to take a franchise to even higher heights. The kind of straight run of success that solidifies a franchise in the pantheon of video game greats. Now that Nintendo was finally abandoning the cartridge format for its latest system, it could actually get a full-on reproduction of the next game. While the game was being built for the PlayStation 2, Activision's VP of Worldwide Studios, Larry Goldberg, would say at E3 2001 that Neversoft had just received their GameCube software development tools and were preparing to bring Pro Skater 3 to the GameCube, but sometime in 2002. As the American launch got closer, though, Activision did a remarkably welcome about-face and confirmed in late September that the GameCube version was just 3 weeks behind the PlayStation 2 version in development, which was slated for release at the end of October, making the GameCube version ready to come out sometime right around the November 18th launch date. In the first week of October, Activision would bring a playable and nearly complete version of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 to Nintendo's Gamers Summit press event in Los Angeles, which impressed attendees by all reports. By the end of the month, Activision announced the game would officially be a launch title for the GameCube, which made it one of the premier third-party titles for the system right alongside Sega's offerings and Nintendo's first-party titles. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 takes heavily from the saying that, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, while at the same time looking to perfect everything in sight. The game takes the next step of introducing a tutorial mode narrated by the man himself, Tony Hawk. This mode will ease a new player into the game from the simplest of controls and moves, while also introducing returning players to the updated control scheme, particularly if they are used to playing with a different controller's layout. Now, this tutorial will take you all the way up through performing complex tricks and combos, at which point a casual player like myself begins to paint the landscape with my character's blood, as I reveal my inability to follow complex control combinations. But that's the thing about Tony Hawk Pro Skater games. They're simultaneously made for both hardcore and casual players at the exact same time. Once you enter the career mode, it reveals how, as there's a fairly close to even split between challenges that require an abundant focus on tricks to rack up higher and higher scores, but the other half of the challenges are rewarded for exploration as you collect the letters spelling skate, find the hidden tape, and interact with environmental obstacles. This is one area where the third game improves over the past ones with its additional graphical horsepower, as the areas you are in are not only much larger, but are actually populated and alive to an extent that previous games could only barely hint at when maybe a car passes by in a certain level. Now there are actual NPC characters around the level that might just be there for show, or might be part of a challenge that you need to achieve in order to earn a reward. The additional complexity of the level design and environments rendered also opens up dramatically more exploration than the previous games did. Going from that point, the graphics are naturally a large leap over the prior games, even over the Dreamcast games, which were still just improvements made from the PlayStation 1 versions. Characters now have vastly more polygons, making much more fluid and realistic character animations possible. Much clearer and higher resolution textures also make for a much more enveloping, interesting, and realistic environment. The sound is, of course, famous for featuring the returning king of licensed soundtracks in video games at that time, but more subtly, the actual sound effects in the game are captured with such quality and clarity that you occasionally get the visceral feeling of either a move being pulled off on a real skateboard, or in my case, the sound of cracking ribs. Being on next-generation hardware also means that the multiplayer mode is significantly more playable than that on PlayStation and Nintendo 64, since the GameCube is more than capable of crunching this game twice over while keeping a consistent frame rate. With a widescreen aspect ratio and a vertical split, it actually leaves a fair deal of space for both players to work with in a split-screen match, too. Returning from the second game is the level editor, which gives you the chance to play with the tools clearly used to make the game, as each object appears on the map first for a second as its wireframe model, before planting down with its textures in place. It's a very nice touch that gives you a sense of being behind the same tools a developer might use, albeit with a controller. The only thing the GameCube version lacked over the PlayStation 2 version it followed was online multiplayer. In an interesting historical footnote, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 on the PS2 was actually the first game for the system in the US to feature online multiplayer, even predating Sony releasing a modem for the system, by letting users hook up third-party USB modems to play the game over the internet with each other. Since the GameCube version was coming out on day one of the system's lifespan, and Nintendo was nowhere near making its online plans clear, let alone implementing any of them, the GameCube version was certain to miss this feature. But the game did benefit from being on the GameCube hardware, with smoother frame rates in a few places, thanks to the extra processing power from Nintendo's Purple Box, as well as some hardware effects that were built into the GameCube, such as texture filtering. If you were picking up a GameCube on launch day back in 2001, there's a very good chance that if you were getting a game besides one of Nintendo's, you were probably getting this game. And for good reason. It's a pixel-perfect version of one of the best games of the year, which, while it didn't have cutting-edge online features, it could be played with arguably the most comfortable and ergonomic controller ever made, on a system that could chew it up and spit it out from a horsepower perspective. It was a very good sign to come that after 5 years of third-party games having to make significant compromises to get their games onto Nintendo's console, now the company had a system that could go toe-to-toe with its competitors.